In 1945, a 43-year-old economics professor from New Hampshire stood in a hotel ballroom in Bretton Woods and watched representatives from 44 nations sign an agreement that would define the architecture of global finance for a generation. His name was Harry Dexter White. By 1959, the system he designed had created the greatest period of shared prosperity in American history. The middle class expanded. Wages rose with productivity. A single income could buy a house, raise a family, and retire with dignity. By 1971, it was dead, and the system that replaced it didn't collapse by accident. It was murdered, deliberately, on a Sunday evening, in a televised address that lasted 15 minutes. The man who killed it was Richard Nixon, and the theft he orchestrated didn't end when he resigned in disgrace 3 years later. It accelerated. It spread across every currency on earth. It became the invisible mechanism that transfers wealth from your labor to their assets every single day you wake up and go to work. This isn't conspiracy. This is documented history. The executive orders exist. The Treasury records are public. The economic data is irrefutable. Before we go through the 5 architects who built this system, you need to understand what monetary theft actually looks like. Not in textbooks. In practice, it doesn't look like a bank robbery. It doesn't look like a con artist with a briefcase. It looks like your paycheck buying less every year while your boss tells you the company can't afford raises. It looks like your parents buying a house for $42,000 in 1973 and your generation needing $400,000 for the same house today. It doesn't look like crime. It looks like policy. It looks like the Federal Reserve chairman on television saying inflation is transitory while your grocery bill doubles. It looks like economic textbooks explaining that 2% inflation is healthy and necessary. It looks like politicians from both parties promising to fix the economy while quietly expanding the money supply by trillions. The invisible control is the most effective control. The cage you cannot see is the cage you defend. 5 architects, 3 mechanisms, 7 bars of a cage you were born inside. And in the final section, I'll show you the exact moment they locked the door and threw away the key. Let's start with the original blueprint. Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, 1944. Harry Dexter White was 43 years old. He was not a Wall Street banker. He was a government economist. A man who had spent the Depression watching capitalism devour itself. A man who believed that unregulated currency markets had caused the chaos of the 1930s, that competitive devaluations had destroyed international trade, that the gold standard had been too rigid and had turned recessions into depressions. He had a plan to fix it. The world was desperate. World War II was still raging. Europe was in ruins. Asian economies were shattered. The British Empire was bankrupt. Traditional currencies were worthless. Nations needed a system to rebuild. They needed stability. They needed America. Here's how White's mechanism worked. Every major currency would peg to the US dollar at a fixed exchange rate. The British pound at $4.03. The French franc at $4.97 per 100 francs. The German mark. The Japanese yen. All fixed to the dollar? But here's the critical detail that changes everything. The US dollar itself was pegged to gold at exactly $35 per ounce, and the United States promised that any foreign government or central bank could exchange their dollars for physical gold at that price. Anytime. No questions asked. Let me show you exactly what that meant. If France accumulated $1 million in trade, they could walk into the US Treasury and demand 28,571 ounces of gold. The United States was legally obligated to deliver. This wasn't symbolic. This was enforced convertibility. The dollar was as good as gold because it could be exchanged for gold. This created discipline. The US government could not print unlimited dollars. If they did, foreign nations would drain Fort Knox. The gold reserves were the constraint. The limit, the brake on monetary expansion. Within 10 years, the system had created unprecedented global growth. European reconstruction accelerated. The Marshall Plan pumped $13 billion into 16 nations. Japan's economy grew at 10% annually. International trade expanded. Exchange rates remained stable. Workers' wages rose in lockstep with productivity. A factory worker in Detroit in 1955 earned enough to buy a house in 7 years. His son, working the same job in 1975, would need 14 years for the same house. Those who attempted to break the system paid dearly. When Britain tried to devalue the pound in 1949 without US approval, Capital fled London in 48 hours. The devaluation happened anyway. But Britain lost its leverage, its empire, its status. The message was clear. The Bretton Woods system wasn't optional. The first bar of the cage was in place. Fixed exchange rates, dollar dominance, gold as the anchor. But it contained the seeds of its own destruction. Let's jump forward 17 years. Washington, D.C., 1961. Robert Triffin was 48 years old. He was not a banker. He was a Belgian-American economist, a professor at Yale, a man who had worked at the Federal Reserve and the International Monetary Fund, a man who saw the fatal flaw in White's design. He testified before Congress with a warning. America was running a persistent trade deficit. Dollars were flowing overseas to pay for imports, military bases, and foreign aid. This was necessary. The world needed dollars for trade and reserves. But here's the contradiction. If the US stopped running deficits, the world would run out of dollar liquidity. International trade would freeze. But if the US kept running deficits, eventually foreign dollar claims would exceed US gold reserves. At that point, the convertibility promise would become mathematically impossible to honor. Here's the specific mechanism. In 1950, the United States held 22,000 tons of gold. Foreign dollar claims totaled $8 billion. The ratio was comfortable. By 1960, the US held 15,000 tons of gold. Foreign dollar claims had grown to $18 billion. By 1965, 12,000 tons versus 29 billion in claims. By 1970, 9,000 tons versus 60 billion. The math was undeniable, at $35 per ounce. 9,000 tons of gold was worth $10.5 billion, but foreign claims were 60 billion. If even 20% of foreign dollar holders demanded gold, Fort Knox would be empty. But here's what historians often miss. This wasn't an accident. It was policy. The US government knew the system was unsustainable. They chose growth over discipline. They chose to finance the Vietnam War without raising taxes. They chose to fund the Great Society programs with monetary expansion. They chose domestic political priorities over international monetary obligations. Within 5 years, the pressure became unbearable. France understood what was happening. Charles de Gaulle called it the exorbitant privilege. In 1965, France began converting dollars to gold. They demanded physical delivery. They sent warships to New York Harbor to collect it. Between 1965 and 1968, France withdrew 1,900 tons of gold from US reserves. Germany followed. Switzerland followed. The gold drain accelerated. President Johnson responded by asking Americans to voluntarily limit foreign travel and investment. It failed. President Nixon inherited a crisis. The gold window couldn't stay open. The choice was clear. Default on the gold promise or defend it by cutting spending. Raising taxes and accepting a severe recession, Nixon chose a third option. The second bar was in place. The Triffin dilemma. The impossible choice. The economic reality that no political system would accept. But the cage wasn't complete. One escape route remained. Camp David, Maryland. August 13, 1971. Richard Nixon was 58 years old. He was not an economist. He was a politician, a paranoid, brilliant tactician who understood power. A man who had lost the 1960 election because the Federal Reserve had tightened money supply before the vote. A man who would not lose 1972 the same way. The economy was weakening. Unemployment was rising. Inflation was accelerating. The gold drain was unsustainable. Something had to give. Here's where it gets darker. Nixon gathered 15 advisors at Camp David that weekend. No advance notice. No press. Total secrecy. They included Treasury Secretary John Connally, Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns, and economist Paul Volcker. The meeting lasted 3 days. The decision was made on Saturday night. On Sunday, August 15, 1971, at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, Nixon interrupted the most popular TV show in America, Bonanza. 40 million people were watching. He announced a new economic policy. Here's how Nixon's mechanism worked. He suspended convertibility of the dollar to gold. Immediately. Permanently, foreign governments could no longer exchange dollars for gold at any price. The gold window was closed. The Bretton Woods system was dead. He imposed a 90-day wage and price freeze. He cut government spending by $4.7 billion. He placed a 10% surcharge on all imports. He called it a defense of American workers against international speculators. Let me show you exactly what that meant at 9p. M, on August 15, the dollar was backed by gold by 9/16p. M, it was backed by nothing except the US government's promise. It became, for the first time in history, a pure fiat currency. Money by decree. Money because the government said so. The implications were immediate and catastrophic for the working class. Without gold convertibility, there was no limit on monetary expansion. The Federal Reserve could create dollars at will. The constraint was gone. The discipline vanished. The printing press was unlimited. But here's the critical detail that changes everything. When you create new money, you don't create new wealth. You dilute existing wealth. Every new dollar makes every existing dollar worth less. This is called inflation. And inflation is a hidden tax that falls hardest on wage earners, savers, and the poor. Those who own assets benefit. Real estate, stocks, gold, commodities. These rise in nominal price as currency devalues. Those who own labor get crushed. Wages are sticky. They adjust slowly. Prices adjust instantly. Within 3 years, inflation hit 12% annually. Gasoline prices tripled during the 1973 oil crisis. Food prices soared. The purchasing power of the dollar fell by half between 1971 and 1980. Workers who had negotiated 3-year contracts in 1971 watched their real wages evaporate. Unions fought back. They struck for cost of living adjustments. Some succeeded temporarily. But productivity gains that had once flowed to workers now flowed to capital. The decoupling began. From 1948 to 1973, productivity rose by 96%. Hourly compensation rose by 94%. Nearly perfect correlation. From 1973 to 2023, productivity rose by 74%. Hourly compensation rose by just 12%, adjusted for inflation. The gap is theft. Systematic, permanent. Designed, Nixon won the 1972 election in a landslide. But he unleashed a monetary regime that has transferred trillions from labor to capital over 5 decades. The third bar snapped shut. Fiat currency. Unlimited monetary expansion. Inflation is policy. Now let's look at the next architect. Washington, D.C., 1979. Paul Volcker was 52 years old. He was not a politician. He was a banker, 6 feet 7 inches tall, a man who smoked cheap cigars and understood that inflation, once unleashed, becomes a political weapon that no elected official wants to fight. President Carter appointed him Federal Reserve Chairman in August 1979. Inflation was 13% and rising. The dollar was collapsing. Gold prices were soaring from $35 per ounce in 1971 to $800 in January 1980. Volcker did something remarkable. He chose to break inflation by breaking the economy. Here's how Volcker's mechanism worked. He raised the federal funds rate from 11% in 1979 to 20% by June 1981. The highest interest rates in American history. This made borrowing extraordinarily expensive. Mortgages hit 18%. Car loans reached 21%. Small businesses couldn't access credit. Unemployment soared to 10.8% by November 1982. The recession was brutal. Manufacturing collapsed. The Rust Belt was born. Entire industries died. But inflation fell from 13.5% in 1980 to 3.2% by 1983. Volcker succeeded in stabilizing the currency, but he also established a precedent. Here's what historians often miss. The Volcker shock proved that the Federal Reserve could control inflation by destroying demand, by crushing workers, by engineering recessions. This became the template. Whenever inflation rose, the Fed would raise rates. Workers would lose jobs. Wages would stagnate. Inflation would fall. Then the Fed would lower rates. Asset prices would soar. The wealthy would get wealthier. Repeat. This is called the Fed put. The guarantee that the Federal Reserve will always rescue asset markets but never rescue workers. Within 10 years, the pattern became permanent. The Plaza Accord of 1985. The Louvre Accord of 1987. The Fed cutting rates after Black Monday. The Fed cutting rates after the savings and loan crisis. Every shock followed by monetary expansion. Every expansion inflating assets. Every asset inflation widening inequality. Those who understood bought assets. Those who didn't kept working. The gap widened. The cage tightened. The fourth bar locked. Central bank omnipotence. Inflation targeting through unemployment. The weaponization of monetary policy against labor. But they needed one final mechanism to make the system irreversible. Here's where the pattern accelerates. New York and London, 1999. Robert Rubin was 61 years old. He was not an economist. He was a Goldman Sachs veteran, Treasury Secretary under Clinton, a man who believed that financial innovation and deregulation were the path to prosperity. In November 1999, Congress passed the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act. It repealed the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933. Glass-Steagall had separated commercial banking from investment banking. It had prevented banks from gambling with depositor money. It had been enacted after the Great Depression to prevent another collapse. The repeal removed the firewall. Here's the specific mechanism. Commercial banks could now merge with investment banks. They could use customer deposits to speculate in derivatives, mortgage-backed securities, and complex financial instruments. They could become too big to fail. And when they failed, the government would have no choice but to bail them out. Between 1999 and 2007, the 5 largest U.S. banks grew from holding 25% of all banking assets to 44%. They became systemically important, untouchable, above the law. This should have been the end, but it wasn't. In 2008, the system collapsed exactly as critics had warned. Lehman Brothers failed. AIG failed. Bear Stearns failed. The entire financial system froze. The government response was immediate and massive. $700 billion in TARP funds. $85 billion to AIG. $29 billion for Bear Stearns. The Federal Reserve created $4.7 trillion through quantitative easing. They bought mortgage-backed securities, treasury bonds, corporate debt. They inflated asset prices to save the banks. Not one major banker went to prison, but here's where it gets darker. Homeowners received almost nothing. 13 million Americans lost their homes to foreclosure between 2007 and 2016. The median household lost 38% of its wealth. A generation was financially destroyed. Meanwhile, the S&P 500 index went from 677 in March 2009 to 4,796 by December 2021, a 600% gain in 12 years. The wealthy recovered in 18 months. Workers never recovered. This established the final principle. Private profits, socialized losses, bailouts for capital, austerity for labor. The fifth bar slammed shut. Too big to fail. Moral hazard. The permanent bailout regime. The cage was complete, and you were born inside it. Now let's connect this to your life right now. In 1971, the median U.S. home cost $28,000. The median household income was $10,500. A house cost 2.6 times annual income. Today, the median home costs $430,000. The median household income is $74,000. A house costs 5.8 times annual income. Check. In 1971, a year of college at a public university cost $474. Today, in the same education costs $11,171. That's a 257% increase. While the dollar has lost 93% of its purchasing power since 1971, check. In 1971, the wealthiest 1% of Americans held 9% of total wealth. Today, they hold 32%. The bottom 50% held 3.5% in 1971. Today, they hold 2%. Check. In 1971, U.S. national debt was $371 billion. Today, it is $36 trillion, a 9,700% increase. The debt can never be repaid, only refinanced, forever. Check. In 1971, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet was $80 billion. Today, it is $7 trillion, an 8,650% expansion of the monetary base. Check. In 1971, the CEO to worker pay ratio was 20-1. Today, it is 399-1. Check. We're not approaching the pattern. We're at the terminal stage. You wake up in a system where your labor is denominated in a currency that loses value every year. You work 40 hours per week and watch your paycheck buy less than your parents' paycheck bought in 1975. You save money in a bank account that earns 0.5% interest while inflation runs at 7%. You cannot buy a house without a 30-year mortgage that costs twice the home's price in interest. You cannot retire without gambling your savings in a stock market that crashes every decade and gets bailed out with your tax dollars. You cannot send your children to college without taking loans that cannot be discharged in bankruptcy. You cannot accumulate wealth through labor when capital gains are taxed lower than wages. You cannot opt out of the dollar when taxes must be paid in dollars and wages are paid in dollars. You cannot save faster than they print. You cannot work harder than they inflate. You cannot escape when every fiat currency on Earth adopted the same model after 1971. Every dollar you earn flows through the architecture Nixon built. Every hour you trade for depreciating currency is an hour of your life transferred to those who own assets that appreciate in nominal terms. And you cannot escape it. 5 architects, 50 years, 1 cage. Harry Dexter White created the dollar standard. Robert Triffin proved it was unsustainable. Richard Nixon killed the gold backing and made currency pure fiat. Paul Volcker established central bank control through managed recessions. Robert Rubin removed the final safeguards and made bailouts permanent. Each piece built on the last, each piece made escape harder. Together, they created the monetary architecture you were never meant to see. They won't teach you this. They'll teach you that inflation is caused by supply chain disruptions and corporate greed. That the Federal Reserve exists to maximize employment and maintain stable prices. That working hard and saving money is the path to wealth. That democracy and free markets determine your economic outcomes. But the architects knew better. John Maynard Keynes wrote in 1919 that Lenin is said to have declared that the best way to destroy the capitalist system was to debauch the currency. By a continuing process of inflation, governments can confiscate, secretly and unobserved, an important part of the wealth of their citizens. Henry Kissinger admitted in 1973, "Who controls the money controls the world." The Treasury documents exist. The Federal Reserve transcripts are public record. The economic data at WTF happened in 1971 is irrefutable. You cannot vote your way out of a monetary system designed to extract value from your labor. You cannot earn your way to wealth when they print faster than you work. You cannot save when they control what your savings are worth. But you can see it, and seeing it changes everything. The cage has no door, but now you can see the bars.